The wind howled like a living thing outside the remote Montana cabin, rattling windows and piling snow against the door. Inside, 12 shivering strangers huddled around a dying fire, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The furnace had died hours ago, and with temperatures dropping to -30, hypothermia was creeping in fast. That's when 17-year-old Ezra spoke up. The locals had always called him the strange mountain boy, the kid who spent his days digging mysterious tunnels and talking to himself in the woods. When he offered to fire up his underground stove, the group erupted in cruel laughter. What could this awkward teenager possibly know about heating a cabin? But Ezra wasn't just any mountain boy. He was the son of a brilliant geothermal engineer who disappeared 5 years earlier, leaving behind cryptic blueprints and a half-finished project buried beneath the mountain. As Ezra lit a single match and dropped it into a small opening in the cabin floor, warmth began radiating upward through invisible channels, defying everything they thought they knew about physics. How had this boy tapped into the mountain's hidden power, and what else was he hiding beneath the frozen ground? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The laughter died first. Then came the shocked silence as heat rose from beneath their feet like a gift from the earth itself. Dr. Margaret Chen, a physics professor from Berkeley, pressed her palm against the wooden floor and jerked it back in surprise. The planks were warm, no, more than warm. They pulsed with a steady, impossible heat that seemed to breathe with the mountain itself. "What the hell did you just do, kid?" Marcus Rivera, a tech executive from Seattle, stripped off his expensive winter jacket as sweat beaded on his forehead. The temperature had climbed 20 degrees in as many seconds. Ezra remained crouched beside the small hole, no bigger than a coffee cup, that he'd somehow known was there. His pale eyes reflected the orange glow emanating from below, and for a moment he looked far older than his 17 years. "It's not magic," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the wind outside. "It's just borrowed heat." Sarah Kim, an investigative journalist who'd been documenting rural poverty for a magazine piece, pulled out her phone to record. The screen showed no signal. They'd been cut off from the outside world since the blizzard intensified. But she needed to capture this somehow. Borrowed from what? The boy's fingers traced invisible patterns on the floor, as if reading a map only he could see. The mountain remembers things: heat, pressure, old fires that burn deep. "My father, he taught me how to ask for help." Father Miguel Santos, who'd been leading a youth group retreat when the storm trapped them, crossed himself instinctively. Something about the boy's tone, the way warmth continued spreading through hairline cracks in the floorboards, felt both miraculous and unsettling. "Your father," Dr. Chen said carefully, her scientific mind grappling with what she was witnessing. What exactly did he do? Ezra's expression darkened. He stood slowly, dusting off his worn jeans, and moved to a corner where shadows gathered thickest. He mapped the mountain's blood vessels, the hot springs that never freeze, the steam that rises through stone, the places where fire sleeps under ice. His voice caught slightly. He said every mountain is alive if you know how to listen. The heat continued rising, and several of the stranded travelers began removing layers of clothing. Tom Bradley, a retired contractor from Denver, knelt to examine the floorboards more closely. "I've been building for 30 years, he muttered, running his hands along the warm wood. "These boards shouldn't conduct heat like this. They're acting like heating elements." "Because that's what they are," Ezra said simply. "Copper runs underneath, following the natural channels. The whole cabin sits on a grid my father designed. He called it thermal acupuncture." Lisa Park, a social worker who'd been delivering supplies to remote communities, felt tears freeze on her cheeks as she stared at the boy. "How long have you been alone out here, Ezra?" 5 years, 4 months, 16 days, he answered without hesitation, still staring into the corner where something glinted in the improved light. "Since the night he disappeared into the lower tunnels." The wind outside reached a new intensity, But inside, the impossible heat made their refuge feel like a sanctuary. The mystery deepened with each passing moment. How had a teenage boy maintained such an elaborate system alone? What had happened to his father? And most unsettling of all, what else lay hidden in the network of tunnels beneath their feet? Dr. Chen noticed that the heat didn't feel electric or gas-powered. It pulsed like a heartbeat, like something alive responding to their presence. When she looked at Ezra's hands, she saw calluses and scars that spoke of years of underground work, of secrets buried deeper than winter frost. The mountain boy had saved them all, but as warmth filled their bones, each survivor began to suspect they'd stumbled into something far more complex than a simple heating system. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but beneath the cabin, something ancient stirred in response to the boy's call. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees by the time Marcus finished his second sweep of the cabin's perimeter. Ice crystals formed on his designer glasses as he pushed through the front door, stamping snow from his Italian leather boots onto the rough-hewn floorboards. "Well?" Sarah looked up from where she'd been attempting to coax life from her dead phone. "Any miraculous cell towers sprouting from the mountainside?" "Nothing. The storm's getting worse." Marcus pulled off his soaked jacket, grimacing at the wet patches spreading across the expensive fabric. "We're completely cut off." Elena emerged from what appeared to be a bedroom, arms wrapped around herself. "There's no electricity back there either, and I swear the temperature just dropped another few degrees." The boy, he'd mumbled something about his name being Finn when they'd first stumbled through his door, sat cross-legged near the far wall, seemingly unbothered by the cold that had the three city dwellers shivering. His fingers moved methodically over what looked like a collection of metal pipes and gauges spread across a worn wooden table. "Excuse me," Sarah called out, her breath now visible in small puffs. "Finn, right? Do you have any blankets, firewood, anything that might help us not freeze to death?" Finn's hands stilled. He glanced up with those unsettlingly pale eyes, then returned to his work without speaking. "Great," Marcus muttered. "We're trapped with the strong, silent type." Elena moved closer to the boy's workspace, curiosity overriding her discomfort. "What is that thing you're building?" For a moment it seemed Finn wouldn't answer. Then, so quietly they had to strain to hear, "Heat." "Heat?" Elena crouched beside him, examining the intricate network of copper tubing and what appeared to be hand-forged metal components. "Like a space heater?" "Not exactly." Finn's fingers resumed their careful assembly, connecting pipes with a precision that spoke of long practice. "Goes deeper." Sarah exchanged glances with Marcus. "Deeper how?" But Finn had retreated into his shell of silence, completely absorbed in his work. The only sounds were the howling wind outside and the soft clinks of metal against metal as he fitted pieces together with surprising skill. The cabin grew colder. Marcus found himself pacing to keep warm, his breath forming clouds that lingered in the frigid air. "This is ridiculous. There has to be a regular heating system somewhere." "I already checked," Elena said, her teeth beginning to chatter. "No furnace, no radiators, not even a proper fireplace. Just that old wood stove, and there's no dry wood anywhere." As if summoned by her words, a particularly vicious gust of wind rattled the windows, and they could hear something, a tree branch, maybe, crash down outside. The storm showed no signs of abating. "How long have you lived here?" Sarah asked Finn, settling onto a rickety chair near his workspace. "Don't you ever get cold?" This time he did look up, those pale eyes studying her face, with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Born here." "Cold's different when you understand it." "Understand it how?" Finn's attention shifted back to his device, but his hands moved more quickly now, as if urged by some internal clock. "Surface cold, deep cold. They're not the same thing." Marcus stopped pacing. "What the hell does that mean?" "Means you're thinking too small." Finn lifted what was now clearly recognizable as some kind of heating apparatus, though unlike any they'd seen before. Tubes spiraled out from a central chamber in patterns that seemed almost organic, like the root system of some metallic plant. Heat doesn't just come from burning things. Where else would it come from? Elena leaned closer, fascinated despite her skepticism. Finn stood, cradling the device against his chest. Down. He moved toward the corner of the cabin where several floorboards appeared newer than the rest. Kneeling, he pried up a section of flooring to reveal what looked like a perfectly round hole extending into darkness below. "Oh, hell no," Marcus said, backing away. "You're not seriously suggesting we follow you into some creepy underground tunnel?" "Marcus," Sarah's voice was tight with cold and growing desperation. "Look at us. We're going to freeze if we stay up here." Finn was already lowering the device into the hole, feeding the connecting tubes down into the darkness with practiced ease. "Takes a few minutes to prime the system," he said. The closest thing to a complete sentence any of them had heard from him. "System." Elena peered into the opening. "How far down does that go?" "Far enough." A low humming sound began to emanate from below, barely audible but somehow felt in their bones. The metal tubes leading down into the darkness began to vibrate gently, and something that might have been warmth seemed to stir in the air around them. "What exactly did you just turn on?" Sarah asked, though she was already moving closer to the opening, drawn by the promise of heat. Finn settled back against the wall, watching them with those unsettling pale eyes. For the first time since their arrival, something that might have been a smile touched his lips. "Told you," he said softly. "Heat." The warmth had been steadily climbing for hours, transforming the cabin from an ice tomb into something almost comfortable. Sarah pulled off her outer jacket for the first time since arriving, watching steam rise from her damp sleeves. Around the main room the others were doing the same. Marcus had rolled up his shirt sleeves, Elena was unwinding her scarf, and even Professor Hartwell had removed his thick wool coat. "This is impossible," Hartwell muttered, kneeling beside one of the metal grates. He pressed his palm against it, then jerked back as if burned. "The surface temperature here has to be over 100 degrees, but I don't hear any machinery. No fans, no pumps, nothing." From his corner near the kitchen, Eli looked up from the soup he was stirring. "Sometimes the best solutions are the quiet ones." "That's not an answer," Marcus said, his financial mind demanding concrete explanations. "Heat doesn't just appear from nowhere. There has to be a source: fuel consumption, energy conversion, basic thermodynamics." Sarah found herself studying the boy more carefully. He moved with an odd economy of motion, as if he knew exactly where to step, exactly how much pressure to apply when he ladled soup into their bowls. When he'd first descended into that impossible opening in the floor, she'd assumed it was some kind of root cellar. But root cellars didn't generate heat that could warm an entire cabin this efficiently. "How long have you lived here?" she asked, accepting a steaming bowl from Eli's outstretched hand. "Long enough." He returned to his stirring, adding something from a small cloth pouch that made the soup's aroma shift from merely good to extraordinary. Elena laughed, though it sounded forced. "You're like a riddle wrapped in flannel, aren't you? Come on, we're all trapped here together. The least you could do is make conversation. What would you like to know?" "Everything," Professor Hartwell interjected, "starting with this heating system. I've been in engineering for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like it. The thermal distribution is perfect. Uniform temperature throughout the cabin, no hot spots, no dead zones. It's like the heat is being generated from multiple points simultaneously." Sarah noticed Eli's hands still for just a moment before resuming their steady rhythm. "The mountain provides," he said simply. "The mountain?" Marcus set down his spoon harder than necessary. "What's that supposed to mean? Mountains don't provide heat. They provide rock, maybe some geothermal activity if you're near a volcanic system. But this area isn't." "How do you know what this area is or isn't?" The question came out sharper than Sarah had intended. She was surprised to find herself almost defending the boy. "We got lost, remember? None of us actually know where we are." Through the cabin's single window, the blizzard continued its relentless assault. The glass was so thick with ice and snow that it might as well have been painted white. They could have been anywhere, 10 miles from civilization or 100. Eli moved toward one of the grates, and Sarah watched him carefully. He didn't kneel like Professor Hartwell had. Instead, he placed one bare foot directly on the metal surface. Sarah winced, expecting to see him leap back in pain, but he simply stood there, perfectly comfortable. "You're not burning," Elena observed, her voice small with wonder. "It knows me," Eli replied, as if that explained everything. Professor Hartwell scrambled to his feet. "Let me see your foot." When Eli didn't move, the older man's voice grew urgent. "Son, I need to understand what's happening here. That grate is hot enough to cause serious burns, but you're standing on it like it's a cool summer sidewalk." "The heat isn't for burning," Eli said, finally stepping away. "It's for living." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. She'd noticed other small things. How Eli never seemed to check the grates before adjusting something below, as if he knew instinctively how they would respond. How the warmth seemed to pulse sometimes, like a great heart beating beneath the floorboards. How the boy always knew exactly where to step, even in the cabin's dim corners, as if the floor itself was guiding him. "There's something you're not telling us," she said quietly. Eli met her eyes directly for the first time since they'd arrived. His gaze was unsettling, not because it was hostile, but because it seemed far older than his apparent years. "There are many things I'm not telling you, but you're alive, you're warm, and you're fed. For tonight, isn't that enough?" Outside, the wind howled louder, as if responding to his words. The cabin's walls creaked under the assault, but the temperature inside remained perfectly, impossibly stable. Marcus opened his mouth to argue, but Sarah caught his eye and shook her head slightly. Whatever was happening here, whatever impossible system was keeping them alive, antagonizing their host, seemed like a poor strategy for survival. But as she settled back with her soup, she couldn't shake the feeling that survival might be more complicated than simply lasting until the storm passed. The warmth had been creeping upward through the floorboards for hours now, and Sarah found herself unconsciously mapping its progress across the cabin. It started beneath the kitchen area where Eli had disappeared into what she'd assumed was a simple root cellar, but the heat didn't spread the way physics dictated it should. Instead of radiating outward in predictable patterns, it moved in deliberate lines, as if following predetermined pathways carved into the mountain itself. Marcus had noticed it too. She watched him press his palm against different sections of the wooden floor, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, loud enough for her to hear but quiet enough that the others might miss it. "Heat doesn't travel like this." Rebecca and Tom remained huddled near the fireplace, which had burned down to glowing embers. The older woman clutched her designer coat tighter around her shoulders, despite the fact that the temperature in the cabin had risen to comfortable levels. Her husband stared out the frost-covered window at the wall of white beyond, occasionally checking his phone for service that wouldn't come. "Maybe we should go down and see what he's actually doing," Rebecca said suddenly, her voice carrying a sharp edge of anxiety. "I mean, what if he's... I don't know. What if there's something wrong with whatever contraption he's got down there?" Sarah exchanged glances with Marcus. They'd both been thinking the same thing, but neither had wanted to voice it first. The boy, Eli, had been underground for nearly 3 hours. In that time, the mysterious warmth had not only filled their cabin, but seemed to extend far beyond its walls. When Sarah had stepped onto the covered porch earlier to retrieve more firewood, she'd noticed that the snow directly around the cabin's perimeter was melting in perfect straight lines, creating bizarre geometric patterns in the white landscape. "He said not to disturb him," Tom offered weakly, but his tone suggested he was looking for someone to override his objection. Marcus stood up, decision made. "I'm going down. This is too strange and I need to understand what's happening." He moved toward the trapdoor that Eli had vanished through, its wooden surface now radiating heat like a stovetop. Sarah found herself following, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and growing unease. The trapdoor wasn't locked. Eli hadn't even bothered to secure it behind him. Marcus lifted it carefully, and they both peered down into what should have been a simple storage space. Instead, rough-hewn stone steps descended much deeper than either had expected, disappearing into darkness that seemed to swallow their flashlight beam. The heat rising from below was intense but not unbearable, carrying with it a strange metallic scent that reminded Sarah of old coins. "Jesus," Marcus whispered, "how deep does this go?" They descended slowly, the wooden steps giving way to carved stone that looked far older than the cabin above. The walls weren't the simple excavated earth Sarah had anticipated, but fitted stone blocks that spoke of deliberate construction. Someone had built this. Someone had planned it. The passage opened into a chamber that defied everything Sarah thought she knew about the small mountain cabin. The space stretched beyond their flashlight's reach, supported by natural rock pillars that disappeared into shadows above. But what made her breath catch wasn't the size of the hidden room. It was the network of channels carved into the floor. Geometric patterns of narrow trenches crisscrossed the stone surface, glowing with a soft orange light that pulsed like a heartbeat. The warmth emanated from these channels, and Sarah could see that they extended through gaps in the walls, disappearing into passages that led deeper into the mountain. Eli knelt at the center of it all, his hands pressed against what looked like a circular depression in the stone floor. His eyes were closed in concentration, and the glow from the channels seemed to pulse in rhythm with his breathing. "What is this place?" Marcus called out, his voice echoing strangely in the vast space. Eli opened his eyes slowly, as if awakening from a deep sleep. When he looked at them, Sarah noticed that his pupils reflected the orange light in an unsettling way. "It's what keeps the mountain warm," he said simply. "What's always kept it warm. The cabin was built here because of this place, not the other way around." Sarah felt the ground beneath her feet vibrate slightly, a barely perceptible tremor that seemed to travel through the glowing channels like electricity through wires. "Built by who?" she demanded. "This construction looks ancient." Eli stood up slowly, and as he did, the pulsing light in the channels grew brighter. "By people who understood that some places are special, that some places are alive." He gestured to the pattern surrounding them. "This isn't just heating, it's communication. And right now, because of the storm, because you're here, the mountain is waking up." Above them, they heard Rebecca scream. The morning brought no relief from the storm. If anything, the wind had grown more vicious overnight, rattling the cabin walls with renewed fury. Sarah pressed her face against the frost-covered window, watching snow devils spiral across what she assumed was the front yard, though the landscape had become an indistinguishable white void. "Coffee's ready," Marcus announced, though his usual executive confidence had been replaced by something more subdued. The events of the previous evening, the impossible warmth rising through the floorboards, the boys' cryptic explanations, had left them all unsettled. Elena emerged from the back bedroom, her designer jacket replaced by one of the cabin's old flannel shirts. "Any word on when this storm might pass?" "Radio's picking up nothing but static," David said from his position near the ancient receiver. "Whatever weather service covers this area, we're not hearing from them." Sarah noticed that Finn had been absent since they'd awakened. His makeshift bed by the fire showed signs of use, but the boy himself was nowhere to be found. "Where's our host?" As if summoned by her words, the cabin's back door opened with a gust of frigid air. Finn stepped inside, shaking snow from his dark hair, carrying an armload of what appeared to be metal components, pipes, valves, and other mechanical parts Sarah couldn't identify. "Checking the external feeds," he said simply, setting his burden down near the fireplace. Ice crystals clung to his eyebrows, yet he seemed remarkably unaffected by what must have been brutal cold outside. "External feeds?" Marcus stepped closer, his curiosity overriding his unease. "For your heating system?" Finn nodded, selecting a wrench from a collection of tools that seemed far too sophisticated for a backwoods cabin. The storms put extra stress on the network. Some adjustments needed. "Network?" Sarah exchanged glances with Elena. "Finn, exactly how extensive is this heating system of yours?" The boy paused in his work, considering her question with that same careful deliberation they'd witnessed before. "Hard to explain without showing you." "Then show us," David said, abandoning the radio. "I'm a mechanical engineer. Maybe I can help." Finn's pale eyes studied David for a long moment. "You won't believe it. After last night," Elena said, settling onto the couch, "I'm prepared to believe quite a lot." Without another word, Finn moved to a section of the cabin's wall that Sarah had assumed was simply rough-hewn logs. He pressed against what appeared to be a knot in the wood, and to her amazement, a panel swung inward, revealing a narrow passageway. "Jesus," Marcus breathed. "How did—" "Follow me," Finn said, ducking into the opening. "Bring flashlights from the kitchen drawer." Sarah felt her heart rate spike. Every instinct screamed against following a strange boy into a hidden tunnel, but the alternative was remaining ignorant about their only source of heat during what was rapidly becoming a life-threatening storm. The passage was narrow but well constructed, with smooth stone walls that seemed to radiate the same gentle warmth they'd felt through the cabin floor. Their flashlight beams revealed that the tunnel extended far beyond what should have been possible given the cabin's size. "This is impossible," David muttered, running his hand along the stone. "The engineering alone, how did you excavate this?" "The structural support required—" "I didn't build it," Finn said over his shoulder. "Just learn to use it." The tunnel opened into a chamber that defied comprehension. Sarah's flashlight beam swept across a vast underground space, revealing a complex network of pipes, valves, and monitoring equipment that belonged in an industrial facility, not beneath a remote mountain cabin. But more unsettling than the sophisticated machinery was the source of the warmth. At the chamber's center, a circular opening in the stone floor glowed with gentle, pulsing light. Not the orange flicker of fire or the harsh glare of electricity, but something softer, more organic. The warmth emanating from it was intense yet comfortable, like being embraced by summer sunshine. "What is that?" Elena whispered, her voice carrying an edge of fear. Finn approached the glowing aperture with practiced ease, checking gauges and adjusting valves with the confidence of someone who'd performed these tasks countless times. "Geothermal," he said, though his tone suggested the explanation was incomplete. David knelt beside one of the monitoring stations, studying readouts that made no sense. "These temperatures, Finn, if these readings are accurate, you're tapping into something far deeper than any conventional geothermal system. The heat signature is off the charts." "How long have you been down here?" Sarah asked, fighting the claustrophobic sensation of being so far underground. "Since I was small. My grandfather showed me, like his grandfather showed him." Finn's voice carried a weight that seemed far too heavy for someone his age. "Someone has to tend it, keep it stable." Marcus stepped closer to the glowing opening, mesmerized by the gentle pulse of light. "Tend what exactly? What are we looking at here?" Finn's hands stilled on the controls, and when he turned to face them, his expression held something between regret and resignation. Something that's been sleeping under this mountain for a very long time. The sound came again at dawn, a low, rhythmic pulsing that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Marcus pressed his ear to the cabin floor, his breath forming small clouds in the still frigid air. Through the wooden planks, he could feel it as much as hear it, a steady thrumming that reminded him uncomfortably of a massive heartbeat. "You feel it too." Sarah's voice startled him. She sat cross-legged near the wall, her laptop balanced on her knees, its screen casting pale light across her face. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. She'd been awake all night, taking readings. "The electromagnetic readings spiked again around 3 a.m., she continued, not looking up from her screen. "Whatever's down there, it's not just heating coils and blower fans." Marcus straightened, brushing dust from his palms. Through the frost-covered windows, the blizzard still raged with undiminished fury. If anything, it seemed worse than yesterday. The snow had drifted so high against the cabin's walls that the lower windows were completely buried. "Where's the kid?" he asked. "Went outside an hour ago. Said he needed to check the intake vents." Sarah finally looked up, her expression troubled. "Marcus, I've been thinking about what he said yesterday. About his father building this system, the dates don't add up. Dr. Chen emerged from the bedroom, supporting Elena's weight as she shuffled to the main room. The older woman's color had improved dramatically overnight, but she still moved like someone recovering from hypothermia. "What dates?" Elena asked, lowering herself carefully onto the couch nearest to where warmth seemed to radiate from the floorboards. Sarah turned her laptop screen toward them. "I did some research before the storm hit. Property records, local newspapers, anything I could find about this place." She pulled up a scanned document. This cabin was abandoned for nearly 30 years. The last recorded owner died in 1987, a hermit named William Thorne. No mention of any family, no records of anyone living here since then. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. Eli said his father died last winter. That would make it 2023. Exactly. Sarah's fingers flew over the keyboard. But here's the thing. I found an old newspaper article from 1988. It mentions Thorne's death, says he was found frozen in a snowstorm just a few hundred yards from this cabin. But it also mentions something else. She highlighted a paragraph on the screen. Listen to this. Local residents reported unusual warmth emanating from the ground around Thorne's property, even weeks after his death. Authorities investigated but found no explanation for the phenomenon. The cabin door burst open, sending a swirl of snow and bitter wind through the room. Eli stumbled inside, his cheeks red from cold, his eyes bright with something that might have been excitement or fear. "The storm's getting worse," he announced, shaking snow from his coat. "But don't worry, Father's system can handle it." "Eli," Dr. Chen said gently, moving toward the boy with the careful demeanor of someone accustomed to dealing with trauma patients. "We'd like to ask you some questions about your father." The boy went very still. Outside, the wind howled like something alive and angry. "What kind of questions?" Eli's voice had changed, become flatter somehow. "When did he build the heating system?" Marcus asked. "It must have taken years of work." "He was always working on it," Eli replied, but his gaze had shifted to something just over Marcus's shoulder. "Even before I was born. He said the mountain told him how." Sarah and Marcus exchanged glances. Elena pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "The mountain told him?" Dr. Chen's voice remained steady, professional. "Father could hear things others couldn't. The mountain has been warm for a very long time, much longer than people remember. He just learned how to help it along." The pulsing beneath their feet seemed to intensify, as if responding to their conversation. Marcus noticed that the warmth was strongest near the center of the room, where Eli now stood. It radiated outward in a rough circle, defying everything he knew about how heat distribution should work. "Eli," Sarah said carefully, "how long have you been living here alone?" For a moment, something flickered across the boy's face, confusion, maybe even pain. Then his expression smoothed over again. "I'm not alone," he said simply. "Father's still here. He's part of the system now. He makes sure it keeps working, keeps everyone warm and safe." The lights flickered, and for just an instant, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift and move with purposeful intent. Then everything returned to normal, if normal was the right word for their situation. Outside, the blizzard raged on, and beneath their feet, something vast and warm and utterly impossible continued its steady, patient work. The ground beneath Sarah's feet hummed with an energy that made her teeth ache. She pressed her palm against the wooden floor, feeling the vibration travel up through her bones like a tuning fork struck against stone. Whatever lay beneath the cabin was growing stronger. "Marcus, come look at this," she called, her voice barely audible over the wind that continued to batter the cabin walls. The storm showed no signs of abating, and the temperature outside had plummeted even further since nightfall. Marcus emerged from the kitchen area where he'd been rationing their remaining food supplies. His face was grim as he knelt beside her, placing his own hand on the floor. His eyes widened immediately. "That's not normal machinery," he said, pulling his hand back as if the wood had burned him. "No heating system vibrates like that." Eli looked up from where he sat cross-legged near the main vent, his young face illuminated by the warm glow emanating from below. "It's working harder because it knows we need more heat," he said simply, as if this explanation should satisfy their growing unease. "Machines don't know things, kid," David interjected from his position by the window, where he'd been monitoring the storm's progress. "They follow programming or mechanical principles. They don't think." "This one does," Eli replied with unsettling certainty. Janet, who had been unusually quiet since their earlier exploration, finally spoke up. "Show us the blueprints, Eli. You said your grandfather designed this system. There have to be technical drawings, schematics, something that explains how it works." For the first time since they'd arrived, Eli's confidence seemed to waver. He glanced toward a wooden chest in the far corner of the room, then back at their expectant faces. "Grandfather said some things weren't meant to be drawn on paper, said some knowledge had to be passed down different ways." "What kind of ways?" Sarah pressed, her journalistic instincts overriding her growing discomfort with the situation. Before Eli could answer, a new sound joined the cabin's mysterious symphony. A low, melodic hum rose from the depths below, almost like singing. The warmth that flowed through the vents carried with it a strange sweetness, like honey and cedar mixed together. "Do you hear that?" whispered Janet, moving closer to the central vent. "It's almost like—" "Like what?" Marcus demanded. "Like voices," she finished, her scientific skepticism warring with what her senses were telling her. The humming grew louder, more complex, as if multiple sources were joining in harmony. The vibration in the floor intensified, and suddenly the cabin felt almost uncomfortably warm. Sweat beaded on David's forehead as he backed away from the window. "Eli, you need to turn this thing down," he said, his voice tight with growing panic. "Whatever's down there, it's getting out of control." But Eli wasn't listening. His eyes had taken on a distant, dreamy quality as he stared into the main vent. "They're welcoming you," he murmured. "They don't get visitors very often." "They?" Sarah's blood ran cold. "Who is they?" The boy's trance broke, and he blinked rapidly, seeming surprised by their alarmed expressions. I meant the system, the heating system. Sometimes I talk about it like it's alive because Grandfather always did." None of them believed him. Marcus moved to the wooden chest Eli had glanced at earlier. "If there are no blueprints, then what's in here?" He reached for the lid, but Eli scrambled to his feet with surprising speed. "Don't!" The boy's voice cracked with genuine fear. "Please don't open that. Not yet. You're not ready." "Ready for what?" Janet demanded, her patience finally exhausted. "Eli, people's lives are at stake here. We're trapped in a blizzard with a heating system that defies physics, and you're talking about voices underground. We deserve to know what we're dealing with." The humming stopped abruptly, leaving only the wind and the soft whisper of warm air through the vents. The sudden silence was somehow more unnerving than the mysterious sounds had been. Eli stood protectively in front of the chest, his small frame dwarfed by the adults surrounding him, but his resolve unwavering. "Grandfather made me promise," he said quietly. "Made me swear I'd only show someone if they truly believed, if they understood that some things in this world can't be explained by science or logic." "Then explain it yourself," Sarah said, her voice gentle but firm. "Help us understand, Eli. Help us believe." The boy looked around at their faces, seeing fear and confusion, but also a growing acceptance that their situation was far from ordinary. Outside, the storm raged on, making their dependence on the mysterious heating system absolute. "Grandfather didn't build this system," Eli said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "He found it. And when he found it, it wasn't alone." The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop several degrees, despite the warm air still flowing through the vents, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. The warmth beneath their feet had grown stronger overnight, pulsing in rhythms that seemed almost organic. Sarah pressed her palm against the floorboards and felt the heat throb like a heartbeat, steady and alive. She'd been awake for hours, listening to that strange humming that seemed to emanate from deep within the earth itself. Marcus stirred beside her, his businessman's instincts apparently unable to fully shut down even in sleep. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his voice tight with concern. "The humming. I've been listening to it all night." Elena's voice drifted from across the room. "It's getting louder." They sat up slowly, careful not to wake David, who remained curled in his corner like a hibernating animal. The cabin felt different in the pre-dawn darkness. The walls seemed to breathe with the rhythm of whatever lay beneath them, and the air itself carried a quality that made Sarah's skin tingle. "Thomas," Marcus called softly toward the boy's sleeping area. "Thomas, we need to talk." But Thomas wasn't there. His blanket lay crumpled and cold, as if he'd been gone for hours. "Where the hell is he?" Marcus was on his feet now, his voice rising despite his attempt to keep quiet. David jolted awake, immediately alert in that way soldiers learn to be. "What's wrong?" "The kid's gone." Elena had moved to the window, peering out into the swirling snow. Visibility's still 0 out there. He couldn't have gone far. But Sarah wasn't so sure. She remembered the way Thomas had looked at them the night before when they'd questioned him about the heating system. There had been something in his eyes, a kind of ancient knowledge that didn't belong in a child's face. And now, with the floor pulsing beneath them like a living thing, she wondered if far meant something different here than it did in the city. The humming grew louder, joined by other sounds from below. Scraping, shuffling, something that might have been voices, though too distant and distorted to make out words. "We need to get down there," David said, already moving toward the trapdoor. "Whatever's happening, that boy is in the middle of it." Marcus grabbed his arm. "Are you insane? We don't know what's down there. For all we know, this whole place could be some kind of what?" Elena challenged. "Say it, Marcus. What do you think this is?" Marcus's face flushed. "I don't know, okay? But normal heating systems don't make the ground sing. Normal kids don't disappear in the middle of blizzards. And normal cabins don't feel like they're alive." Sarah knelt by the trapdoor, running her fingers along its edges. The wood was warm, almost hot, and she could feel vibrations running through it like electrical current. "He saved our lives," she said quietly. "Whatever Thomas is, whatever this place is, we'd be dead without it." "Maybe we still will be," Marcus muttered. The humming stopped abruptly, plunging the cabin into a silence so complete that Sarah's ears rang. Then, from far below, came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, ascending. They all stepped back from the trapdoor as it began to open from beneath. Thomas's head appeared first, his dark hair dusted with what looked like snow but glittered strangely in the lamplight. His eyes held that same ancient quality Sarah had noticed before, but now it was stronger, as if something fundamental had awakened in him during the night. "You're all awake," he said simply, pulling himself up into the cabin. "Good. It's time." "Time for what?" David asked, his military bearing evident despite his civilian clothes. Thomas looked at each of them in turn, and Sarah felt as though he was measuring something in their faces, searching for qualities she couldn't name. "The storm's not natural," he said finally. "It's been called, and now it's answered." "Called by what?" Elena pressed. "By us. By me." Thomas moved to the window, his small frame silhouetted against the swirling white. "My family's been keeping watch here for generations, waiting. The heating system isn't just keeping you warm, it's keeping other things awake." The floor pulsed again, stronger this time, and Sarah heard that scraping sound more clearly now, like claws on stone, like something large moving through tunnels far below. "Jesus Christ," Marcus breathed. "What have you done?" Thomas turned back to them, and in the lamplight, his face looked older than his years, marked by responsibilities no child should carry. "What I had to do, what my grandfather did, and his grandfather before him. But this time is different. This time you're here." The cabin shuddered around them, and somewhere in the distance, carried on the wind, came a sound that definitely wasn't human. It was answered by another, closer this time, and then another, until the storm itself seemed to be singing back to whatever lay beneath their feet. Thomas reached for his coat, We need to go deeper, all of us, before they reach the surface. The warmth beneath their feet had grown stronger overnight, and with it came something else, a rhythmic pulsing that seemed to sync with their heartbeats. Sarah pressed her palm against the wooden floor, feeling the gentle throb through the planks like a sleeping giant's breath. "It's getting stronger," she murmured to Marcus, who sat hunched over his laptop, frantically typing notes about their situation. The blue glow from his screen cast eerie shadows across his face. "The temperature readings are off the charts," he replied without looking up. "Whatever's down there is generating more heat than any conventional system could produce. It's thermodynamically impossible." Ellie emerged from the kitchen area, clutching a steaming mug of coffee. Dark circles rimmed her eyes. None of them had slept well with the strange sensations beneath them. "Has anyone else noticed the patterns in the walls?" They all turned to look where she pointed. The wooden walls, warmed by the mysterious heating system, now displayed intricate grain patterns that seemed to shimmer and shift in the lamplight. What had appeared to be ordinary wood grain the day before now resembled elaborate symbols flowing from one wall to another like written language. "That's impossible," David said, setting down his phone. "Wood grain doesn't change. It's a fixed pattern formed during growth." Tommy, who had been quietly whittling by the window, finally spoke. "My grandfather used to say, 'The mountain remembers everything. Every storm, every season, every person who lived on it.'" He held up the piece of wood he'd been carving, a small figure that looked remarkably like their cabin, complete with tiny tunnels underneath. "Tommy," Sarah said gently, moving closer to him, "what exactly did your grandfather build down there?" The boy's knife paused mid-stroke. For a long moment, the only sounds were the wind outside and that strange rhythmic pulsing from below. When he looked up, his eyes held a gravity that seemed far too old for his years. "He didn't build it," Tommy said quietly. "He found it." The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything they thought they understood. Marcus stopped typing. David put down his phone completely. Even Ellie, who had been skeptical of everything Tommy said, moved closer. "What do you mean, found it?" Marcus asked. Tommy set down his carving and walked to the center of the room, where the warmth was strongest. "There used to be people here, long before my grandfather, long before anyone. The mountain was their home, and when the ice came, they went deeper." "Ice Age," Sarah whispered, understanding beginning to dawn. "You're talking about the Ice Age. My grandfather was a mining engineer before he came here. He thought he was just digging a cellar, but he broke through into something that was already there. Chambers and tunnels that went deeper than he could explore, and in the center of it all, something that had been waiting." David laughed, but it sounded forced. "Come on, kid. You're talking about some kind of ancient civilization? That's ridiculous." As if in response to his skepticism, the pulsing beneath them intensified. The coffee mug in Ellie's hands began to vibrate gently, creating tiny ripples on the surface. The symbols in the wood grain seemed to glow brighter. "Look outside," Tommy said simply. They moved to the windows, wiping away the condensation to peer into the storm. What they saw made them all step back in surprise. The snow around the cabin wasn't just melting, it was forming patterns. Intricate spirals and geometric shapes spread outward from beneath the cabin like a vast mandala drawn in cleared earth and emerging vegetation. "The heating system," Marcus said slowly, "it's not just warming the cabin, it's warming the entire mountainside." "That's not possible," David insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. The energy required would be enormous. "Unless it's not coming from above," Sarah said, pieces clicking together in her mind. "Tommy, how deep did your grandfather say these chambers went?" "He never found the bottom," Tommy replied. "But he said you could feel the mountain's heartbeat down there. Said it had been beating long before the first human ever set foot on this land, and it would keep beating long after we were gone." The pulsing grew stronger, as if responding to their growing understanding. Through the floorboards they could now hear something else, a distant rushing sound like underground rivers or wind through vast caverns. Ellie set down her mug with shaking hands. We need to see what's down there. No, David said firmly. We need to wait for rescue and get out of here. This is getting too weird for me. But even as he spoke, they all knew there would be no rescue until the storm passed. And with each passing hour, the presence beneath them grew stronger, more insistent, as if it had been waiting decades for someone to discover its secrets. Tommy picked up his carving knife again, his young face serious. My grandfather used to say, the mountain chooses who it shows itself to. Maybe it chose you. The tremor began as a whisper beneath their feet, so subtle that Marcus initially dismissed it as his imagination. But when the coffee cup on the wooden table started to vibrate in tiny circles, creating ripples across its dark surface, everyone in the cabin fell silent. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her hand instinctively reaching for David's arm. Before anyone could answer, another tremor rolled through the ground, stronger this time. The entire cabin groaned, its wooden frame creaking like an old ship in a storm. Through the frost-covered windows, they could see the snow-laden pine trees swaying despite the absence of wind. Thomas stood frozen near his contraption, his young face pale with what looked like genuine fear for the first time since they'd arrived. The metal pipes extending from his underground heating system were humming now, a low, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate in their bones. "Thomas," Elena said carefully, setting down her own cup with deliberate precision, "what exactly did you build down there?" The boy's eyes darted between them, then down at the floor where the warm air continued to flow from the vents he'd carved. I thought I understood it," he said quietly. "But it's getting stronger." Another tremor, and this time the sound was unmistakable. Something vast moving beneath the earth, like the shifting of tectonic plates compressed into the space under their cabin. The lanterns hanging from the ceiling beams swayed hypnotically, casting dancing shadows across their worried faces. Marcus pushed himself up from his chair, his journalist instincts overriding his fear. "Getting stronger, how? What aren't you telling us?" "The chamber," Thomas said, his voice barely audible above the growing hum. "When I first found it, it was cold, dead. But when I connected the pipes, when I started drawing heat from it..." He trailed off, running his hands through his dark hair. "You woke something up," Dr. Chen finished, her scientific mind already racing ahead to conclusions she didn't want to reach. The underground rumbling intensified, and now they could hear something else, a rhythmic pulsing, like a massive heartbeat echoing through stone and soil. The warm air flowing from the vents grew warmer still, bringing with it that strange mineral scent that none of them had been able to identify. Sarah backed toward the door, though they all knew there was nowhere to go in the blizzard raging outside. "This is insane. We need to..." Her words were cut off by a sound that made them all freeze, the distinct crack of splitting wood, not from the cabin but from somewhere below, deep below. Thomas dropped to his knees beside one of his vents, pressing his ear to the opening. What he heard there made his face go white. "It's moving," he whispered. "Whatever's down there, it's really moving now." The rumbling suddenly stopped, leaving them in a silence so complete that their own breathing seemed unnaturally loud. Even the wind outside had died away, as if the entire mountain was holding its breath. Then, impossibly, they heard a voice. It wasn't human, couldn't be human. The sound emerged from the vents like wine through a vast cathedral, but shaped into something that almost resembled words. The language was nothing any of them had ever heard, yet somehow Marcus found himself understanding fragments of meaning, awakening, warmth, hunger. Elena grabbed Thomas by the shoulders, her grip tight enough to leave marks. "How do we stop it? There has to be a way to shut it down." "I don't know." Thomas's composure finally cracked completely. "I never meant for this to happen. I just wanted to help my grandmother stay warm, and when I found the chamber, I thought it was just geothermal activity, some kind of natural hot spring deep underground." The voice from below grew louder, more insistent, and now the warm air carried something else with it, a sweet, cloying scent that made their heads spin. David staggered, catching himself against the wall as the world seemed to tilt around them. "Whatever you've awakened, Dr. Chen said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "It's been sleeping for a very long time, and I don't think it's happy about being disturbed." The cabin shuddered again, more violently this time, and they heard the unmistakable sound of something large forcing its way through narrow spaces far beneath them. The network of tunnels Thomas had described was no longer just carrying heat, it was providing a pathway for something to rise. Outside, the blizzard resumed with supernatural fury, as if responding to whatever stirred below. They were truly trapped now, caught between the killing cold above and the awakening presence below, with only a frightened mountain boy and his impossible heating system standing between them and forces beyond their comprehension. The metal pipes began to glow with their own inner heat, and Thomas backed away from his creation with tears streaming down his face, finally understanding that some discoveries were never meant to be made. The tremors began just after midnight. Sarah jolted awake on the cabin floor, her sleeping bag sliding across the wooden planks as the entire structure groaned around them. The warm amber glow from Ezra's heating system flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls as dust rained down from the rafters. What the hell was that? Marcus scrambled to his feet, nearly tripping over Elena, who was already reaching for her boots. Another tremor rolled through the ground beneath them, stronger this time. The cabin's windows rattled in their frames, and somewhere in the darkness outside they could hear the crack and crash of falling trees. But it wasn't the sound of wind damage. This was something else entirely. Ezra stood frozen by the kitchen window, his face pale in the strange light emanating from the floor vents. "It's not supposed to do this," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rumbling that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. "What's not supposed to do what?" Dr. Chen demanded, grabbing the boy's shoulders. "What exactly is happening down there?" Before Ezra could answer, a brilliant flash of orange light erupted from the basement access, so bright it momentarily blinded them all. The heat that followed was intense but brief, like standing too close to a furnace when its door swings open. Then, just as suddenly, everything went quiet. The silence was almost worse than the noise. Marcus was the first to move, grabbing a flashlight and heading toward the basement door. "We need to see what's down there. Now." "No!" Ezra's voice cracked as he lunged forward, but Elena caught his arm. "Kid, if this thing is going to collapse the whole mountain on us, we need to know." Her voice was gentler than Marcus's, but just as firm. "You said yourself it's not supposed to be doing this." Tears streamed down Ezra's face as he looked between them and the basement door. "My grandfather always said never to go too deep when it's angry. He said the earth remembers old hurts, and sometimes—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Sometimes what?" Sarah pressed, though part of her dreaded the answer. "Sometimes it wants to hurt back." Another flash of light pulsed through the floorboards, weaker this time, but accompanied by a sound like distant thunder or voices. It was impossible to tell which. Dr. Chen knelt beside Ezra, her scientific mind warring with something deeper and more primitive. "You're telling us your heating system is somehow connected to something larger, aren't you? Something that's been here much longer than your family?" Ezra nodded miserably. "Grandfather called them the old lines, said they ran under most of the mountain, connecting places that shouldn't be connected. Our system, it just borrows a little, like sipping from a stream. But with all of us here needing so much heat for so long, we've been drawing too much power," Sarah finished, the pieces clicking into place, "and now whatever's down there is responding." The temperature in the cabin began to fluctuate wildly. One moment they were sweating in tropical heat, the next they could see their breath in the suddenly frigid air. Outside, the blizzard continued to rage, but now it seemed almost secondary to the chaos brewing beneath their feet. Marcus had reached the basement door despite Ezra's protests. He yanked it open and immediately staggered backward, his face reflecting the impossible light that spilled up from below. "Jesus Christ, you all need to see this." They crowded around the doorway and peered down into what had once been a simple basement. The stone walls now pulsed with veins of molten light that seemed to breathe with a rhythm all their own. The tunnel system Ezra had shown them earlier had expanded, with new passages branching off in directions that hurt to follow with their eyes, and in the distance, so far down it seemed impossible the basement could extend that deep. Something large was moving. "It's a network," Dr. Chen breathed, her scientific detachment cracking. "A living network under the entire mountain range, and we've somehow activated it." The moving thing in the depths was getting closer. They could hear it now, a sound like grinding stone mixed with something organic, something that might have been breathing, if breathing could shake the foundations of the earth. Elena grabbed supplies from their scattered belongings. "We need to leave, now." "We can't," Marcus said, never taking his eyes off the basement. "The storm's still going. We'll freeze to death in minutes out there." "And if we stay here?" Sarah's voice was tight with panic. Ezra stepped forward, his young face set with determination that seemed far too old for his years. "There's one way. Grandfather told me, but he made me promise never to try it unless—" He swallowed hard. "Unless everything depended on it." The thing in the depths roared, and every light in the cabin went out except for the otherworldly glow rising from below. "What way?" they all asked in unison. Ezra picked up his grandfather's worn journal from the kitchen table. "We have to go deeper." The silence that followed Marcus's confession stretched like a taut wire. Sarah felt her world tilting, the warm cabin suddenly feeling like a cage. The boy she'd grown to trust, whose gentle hands had tended their wounds and whose invention had saved their lives, was connected to her father's disappearance. "Tell me everything," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind outside. Marcus remained by the tunnel entrance, his shoulders hunched as if bearing an invisible weight. "Your father came here 3 years ago. He wasn't the first scientist to find us, but he was different. Most come looking to exploit what we've built. He came looking for answers." David shifted restlessly beside the main heating unit, his businessman's instincts clearly warring with the impossible reality surrounding them. "What kind of answers?" "The same ones you're all seeking now." Marcus finally turned to face them, his young features etched with an ancient sadness. "Why the earth responds to certain people. Why some can feel the pulse beneath their feet while others remain deaf to it. Why my family has been guardians of something we barely understand for over 2 centuries. Elena leaned forward, her scientific mind grasping for concrete details. "Your family has been here for 200 years? "Not here exactly. We move when we have to, when too many questions are asked, or when the government gets too interested, but always in these mountains, always following the network." Marcus gestured toward the tunnel. "The heating system isn't my invention. It's just the latest iteration of something my ancestors built and rebuilt, generation after generation." Sarah's hands trembled as she spoke. "My father's research. He was studying geothermal anomalies in this region. He thought he'd found evidence of an undiscovered energy source. He found more than that." Marcus moved to one of the carved wooden panels on the wall and pressed a specific pattern. The wood slid aside, revealing a small compartment filled with journals and documents. "He found us." The revelation hit the group like a physical blow. Thomas, who had remained quiet through most of their underground exploration, suddenly straightened. That's why the government was involved. That's why the search was called off so quickly. They didn't want him found because they knew what he'd discovered. Marcus nodded grimly. "Your father spent weeks here, documenting everything. He understood what my family has always known, that this isn't just geothermal energy. It's something older, something that responds to human consciousness in ways that challenge everything modern science believes about the world." Sarah approached the hidden compartment with shaking steps. Among the documents, she recognized her father's handwriting, his careful diagrams and excited annotations. But there were other papers too, older ones, written in different hands. "Where is he now?" she asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. "Safe," Marcus said quickly. "But hidden. When government agents started asking questions in the nearest town, when helicopters began circling these mountains, my grandfather made a choice. He took your father deeper into the network, to places where no satellite can track, no GPS can reach. Elena examined one of the older documents, her eyes widening at the technical diagrams. These schematics, they're describing a heating and energy distribution system that shouldn't be possible with the technology available when these were drawn. My ancestors weren't working alone, Marcus admitted. The mountains themselves taught them. The earth responded to their need, showed them how to work with forces that your science is only beginning to acknowledge. David's pragmatic mind struggled with the implications. You're talking about some kind of, mystical connection to the planet? I'm talking about the same force that's kept you all alive for the past 3 days, Marcus replied. The same energy that responds when I place my hands on the control stones that flows through tunnels carved by something more than human tools. The wind outside seemed to intensify, as if responding to their conversation. Sarah clutched her father's journal, feeling the weight of years of separation and uncertainty. Can you take me to him? Marcus hesitated. The blizzard needs to pass first, and... He looked at each of them in turn. Everyone here would have to come. My grandfather's rule. No one leaves the deep network with knowledge of our location unless everyone is committed to protecting what we've built. Thomas laughed bitterly. So, we're prisoners now? You're survivors, Marcus corrected. And now you're faced with the same choice your father made, Sarah. Become guardians of something that could change the world, or what? David demanded. Marcus's expression grew solemn. Or forget you ever found us. There are ways, older than the heating system, that can cloud memory and redirect understanding. You would leave these mountains convinced you survived the blizzard in an abandoned cabin, nothing more. Sarah looked around at her companions. The friends who had shared this impossible journey, who had walked through tunnels that defied explanation and felt the mountain's heartbeat beneath their feet. The choice before them would define not just their futures, but potentially the future of human understanding itself. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, but inside the cabin, warmed by forces beyond comprehension, 5 people faced a decision that would change everything. The trembling in the floorboards had grown stronger through the night, and by dawn, hairline cracks spiderwebbed across the cabin's wooden planks. Sarah pressed her ear to the floor, listening to what sounded like a vast heartbeat pulsing beneath them. The rhythm was hypnotic, almost alive. We need to go down there, Marcus announced, pacing near the cellar entrance. Whatever Eli's been hiding, it's affecting the entire mountain now. Elena looked up from where she'd been sketching the crack patterns. The fissures are following specific lines. Look. She held up her notebook, revealing an intricate web of fractures that seemed to radiate outward from the cellar in perfect geometric patterns. This isn't random. It's deliberate. David stood at the window, watching the snow swirl in impossible spirals above the tree line. The weather's changing too. The storm's pulling back, but not naturally. It's like something's drawing it away. Eli emerged from the kitchen carrying a steaming pot of coffee, his movements careful and measured. The others watched him with a mixture of wariness and curiosity that had replaced their earlier fear. Since his confession about the heating system's true nature, he'd seemed almost relieved, as if carrying the secret had been a burden. "The mountain's waking up," he said quietly, setting the pot on the table. "I knew this day would come eventually. Pa always said it would." "Your father knew about this?" Sarah asked, straightening up from the floor. Eli nodded, pouring coffee into mismatched mugs. Built the first connection when he was young, thought he could just tap into a little warmth, help folks survive the harsh winters. But the mountain, it wanted more than that. Marcus stepped closer to the cellar door. "What does it want?" "Connection," Eli replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's been alone for so long. Sleeping. But when people gather here, when they need help, it responds, feeds off the community, the shared warmth of human presence." Elena's pencil stopped moving across her notebook. "That's why the heating system works better when we're all together. It's not just heating the cabin, it's drawing energy from our interactions." The floor shuddered again, more violently this time. A low, resonant hum filled the air, seeming to come from everywhere at once. The coffee in their mugs rippled in concentric circles. "It's getting stronger," David observed, gripping the windowsill as the cabin swayed slightly. "How much can the structure take?" Eli moved toward the cellar door, his hand hovering over the handle. "There's something I haven't told you about why I really stay here alone." He paused, gathering courage. "Every winter, someone has to make the choice. Feed it enough to keep it satisfied, or let it go hungry and risk it reaching out further, affecting the whole valley." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Feed it what? Life force, connection, human warmth. Eli's voice grew heavy. "My pa figured out that one person staying close, keeping it company through the long months, was enough. But if that person leaves..." The implications hung in the air like smoke. Marcus backed away from the cellar door. "You're saying it needs someone to stay, permanently." "Not permanently," Eli corrected, "but for the winter. Someone has to tend it, keep the connection strong. Otherwise it reaches out, looking for what it needs. Could affect the whole mountain range, draw people in from miles around." Elena looked at her sketches with new understanding. The geometric patterns in the cracks, they're like roots, aren't they? Spreading out, searching for sources of human energy. The humming grew louder, and now they could feel it in their bones, a vibration that seemed to synchronize with their heartbeats. The warmth that had been their salvation now felt different, more possessive, more aware. "We need to see it," Sarah said suddenly. "Whatever's down there, we can't make an informed decision without understanding what we're dealing with." Eli's hand tightened on the cellar door handle. "It's not dangerous exactly, but once you've seen it, really seen it, the connection becomes stronger. Harder to break." David turned from the window. "The storm's almost completely gone now. We could probably make it down the mountain in a few hours." "Could we?" Marcus asked pointedly. "Or would it follow us, draw us back?" The question settled over them like a heavy blanket. Through the cleared windows they could see the valley below, peaceful and snow-covered, normal, but the warmth pulsing through the floorboards told a different story, of something ancient and patient and desperately lonely, something that had found them in its web of tunnels and might not be willing to let them go. Eli opened the cellar door. Warm, golden light spilled upward, carrying with it a sound like distant singing. "If you're going to look," he said, "now's the time, before it gets any stronger." The warmth beneath their feet had become a living thing, pulsing with a rhythm that matched their collective heartbeat. Sarah pressed her palm against the wooden floorboards and felt it, a gentle thrum that seemed to acknowledge her touch. The realization that they were standing above something far more complex than underground tunnels was settling over the group like a heavy blanket. Marcus had been pacing for the better part of an hour, his corporate mind struggling to process what defied every principle of engineering he'd ever learned. "There has to be a logical explanation," he muttered, running his hands through his disheveled hair. "Geothermal activity, maybe? Or some kind of underground spring system." Elena looked up from where she'd been sketching the strange symbols they'd found carved into the walls. "Marcus, you felt it too down there. That wasn't just hot water moving through pipes." Her voice carried a mixture of wonder and unease. "It was responding to us." Tommy sat cross-legged near the main heat vent, his weathered hands resting on his knees. The boy who had seemed so simple, so unassuming when they'd first met, now appeared to be holding the weight of ancient knowledge. His pale eyes reflected the orange glow emanating from below. "My great-grandfather used to tell stories," Tommy said quietly, his voice barely audible above the wind that continued to howl outside. "Stories about the mountain, about things that lived here long before people came with their cities and their roads." David leaned forward, his journalist instincts overriding his fear. "What kind of things?" Tommy's gaze drifted to the window, where snow continued to pile against the glass in impossible drifts. He called them the deep dwellers, said they weren't evil, just different, old. They'd been sleeping under the mountain for longer than anyone could remember. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the blizzard outside. "Sleeping?" until someone woke them up. Tommy's eyes met hers, and she saw something there that made her stomach clench. Guilt, fear, and something that looked almost like relief at finally sharing his burden. "I didn't mean to. I was so tired of being cold all the time, of watching my grandmother shiver through another winter with no money for heating oil." The confession hung in the air like smoke. Elena set down her pencil, her artistic eye catching details the others had missed. "You've been feeding them," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "That's why you keep going down there. That's why the system keeps growing." Tommy nodded slowly. "They're hungry. They've been hungry for so long. But they're not. They don't want to hurt anyone. They just want to feel warm again like we do." He paused, swallowing hard. "I bring them things, food sometimes, batteries. They seem to like metal things, and in return, they keep us all from freezing to death," Marcus finished, his analytical mind finally grasping the impossible transaction taking place beneath their feet. A sudden vibration ran through the floor, stronger than before. The orange glow from the vents intensified, and they could hear something moving in the tunnels below. Not the sharp scrabbling of claws or the wet sliding of something serpentine, but a sound like wind through vast chambers, like breathing. "They know we're talking about them," Tommy said matter-of-factly. "They're curious about you all. They've never been this close to so many people at once." Sarah found her voice, though it came out smaller than she'd intended. "Are we safe?" Tommy considered this carefully, tilting his head as if listening to something only he could hear. "They're not like the stories people tell about monsters in the dark. They're more like," he struggled for the right word, "like gardeners. They want things to grow, to be warm and alive." David pulled out his phone, though the battery was nearly dead and they'd lost signal days ago. "This is impossible. We're talking about some kind of symbiotic relationship with creatures that shouldn't exist." "Shouldn't they?" Elena asked, her artist's intuition grasping truths that logic couldn't touch. "We've only lived on this mountain for what, a couple 100 years? What if they were here first? What if they'd been waiting all this time for someone to understand?" Another pulse of warmth rose from below, and with it came a sound that might have been communication, a low harmonic resonance that seemed to carry meaning beyond words. Tommy's face brightened, the first genuine smile they'd seen from him since their arrival. "They want to show you something," he said, standing and moving toward the trapdoor they'd discovered earlier. "Something important, but it has to be all of us together." The group exchanged glances, fear warring with curiosity. Outside, the blizzard raged with undiminished fury. Below, ancient things stirred in the warmth and darkness, patient as stone but alive with possibilities none of them could yet imagine. The choice, when it came, felt inevitable. The trembling beneath their feet had grown more violent, sending dust cascading from the rafters like snow. Elena pressed her back against the cabin wall, watching as Marcus frantically gathered their few remaining supplies into his backpack. Through the windows, the blizzard still raged with supernatural fury, but now something else moved in the white darkness, shapes that defied explanation, writhing between the trees. "We can't stay here," Marcus said, his voice tight with urgency. "Whatever's happening underground, it's destabilizing everything." Sarah clutched her laptop, its screen flickering with impossible readings from the sensors they'd placed around the property. "The thermal signatures are off the charts. It's like the entire mountain is heating up from the inside." Thomas stood near the trapdoor that led to Ezra's tunnels, his face pale in the orange glow that pulsed from below. "Where is he? Ezra should have been back by now." "Maybe he can't come back," David muttered, checking his camera equipment one last time. "Maybe whatever's down there has him." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. The boy had descended into his mysterious network of tunnels 3 hours ago, claiming he needed to fix what was broken. The heating system that had saved them from freezing had become something far more sinister, and now the very ground beneath them felt alive, breathing with an alien rhythm. A sound echoed from the depths, not mechanical but organic, like a heartbeat amplified through stone and earth. "That's it," Marcus said, shouldering his pack. "We're leaving, now." "Into that?" Sarah pointed at the windows where the blizzard had taken on an almost sentient quality. The snow moved in patterns, forming spirals and geometric shapes before dissolving back into chaos. "We'll die out there in minutes. We'll die here too if we don't move." Thomas was already pulling on his coat. Whatever Ezra's heating system really is, it's not meant for the surface world. We've triggered something that should have stayed buried. Elena thought of the boy's strange knowledge, his two old eyes, the way he'd spoken about the mountain as if it were a living thing. She remembered the symbols carved into the tunnel walls, predating any known civilization, and the impossible warmth that flowed through channels that seemed to grow rather than being built. Another pulse from below, stronger this time. The cabin's foundation groaned, and somewhere in the walls wood began to splinter. "The thermal readings," Sarah said suddenly, staring at her screen. "They're not random. Look at this pattern. It's spreading outward from here in perfect mathematical spirals. This isn't a heating system. It's a transmission array." "Transmitting what?" David asked, though his expression suggested he didn't want to know the answer. Before Sarah could respond, the trap door burst open. But it wasn't Ezra who emerged. It was heat so intense it shimmered like liquid mercury, accompanied by that organic pulsing sound and something else. Whispers, voices speaking in harmonics that seemed to bypass the ears and speak directly to the mind. Elena grabbed her coat, decision made. The storm, whatever's happening down there, it's connected to the blizzard. That's not natural weather. It's been keeping us here, keeping us over this spot. Marcus nodded grimly. We're not just trapped, we're positioned. For what? The answer came in the form of light, erupting from the tunnels below. Not the warm orange glow they'd grown accustomed to, but something cold and blue-white that seemed to pull at their vision, making the air itself appear to bend and warp. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and Elena could almost make out words in languages that predated human speech. Thomas was at the door, fighting with the handle that seemed fused shut by ice that formed even as they watched. "It won't open! The cold! It's sealing us in!" "Then we go down," Elena said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "If Ezra's down there, maybe he can explain what's happening, maybe he can stop it. Or maybe he's part of it," Marcus countered. "Maybe he always has been." The pulsing from below reached a crescendo, and suddenly the voices weren't whispers anymore. They were clear, speaking in unison, calling out in what sounded almost like welcome. The blue-white light began seeping up through the floorboards, and where it touched, the wood took on a crystalline quality, as if it were being transformed at the molecular level. Elena looked at the others. Marcus with his protective instincts fighting against impossible odds, Sarah clutching her scientific instruments like talismans against the unknown, Thomas and David pale but determined. They were no longer skeptical city folk. They were survivors facing something that challenged everything they thought they knew about reality. The mountain held its breath around them, and Elena realized they'd passed the point of no return. The only way out was through whatever lay beneath their feet, in the tunnels where a mountain boy with ancient eyes was either their salvation or the key to something that should never have been awakened. The earth beneath their feet thrummed with an energy that seemed to pulse in rhythm with their heartbeats. Sarah pressed her palm against the wooden floor, feeling the vibrations travel up through her arm. Whatever Ezra had awakened down there was growing stronger by the hour. "We need to talk," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the tense silence that had settled over the cabin. He stood near the window, watching fresh snow pile against the glass, about what happens when this storm ends. Ezra looked up from where he sat cross-legged on the floor, his hands resting on a series of carved symbols Sarah hadn't noticed before. They were etched directly into the floorboards, worn smooth by years of use. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Marcus continued, turning to face the group, "we've seen something extraordinary here, something that could change everything. Energy, heating, maybe even—" "No." Ezra's voice was quiet, but firm. You don't understand what you're asking. Linda shifted uncomfortably on the couch, her laptop balanced on her knees. She'd been documenting everything she could remember, typing frantically whenever the generator provided power. Ezra, this technology could help millions of people. Think about the environmental impact, the energy crisis. The mountain chooses who it trusts, Ezra interrupted, his eyes reflecting the strange amber glow that had been emanating from the floorboards. It took my family 3 generations to build this relationship, 3 generations of respect, of understanding. You can't just package that up and sell it. Tom laughed, but there was no humor in it. Relationship? Kid, you're talking about geological formations like they're alive. The floor beneath them pulsed once, hard enough to rattle the windows. Tom's expression shifted from skepticism to unease. Aren't they? Sarah found herself asking. She'd been quiet for most of the conversation, lost in thought about everything they'd experienced. The whispers in the tunnels, the way the warmth seemed to respond to Ezra's touch, the impossible geometry of the underground chambers. I mean, really think about it. The way this place responds to emotions, to intentions, the way it knew we were in danger before we did. Marcus pulled out his phone, though they all knew there was no signal. I've been thinking about the legal implications. If this land belongs to Ezra's family, then technically, it doesn't belong to us, Ezra said simply. We belong to it. There's a difference. The generator coughed and died, plunging them back into the amber twilight that had become their new normal. But now Sarah could see that the glow wasn't just coming from the floor. It traced patterns along the walls, following what looked like veins of some luminescent mineral. How long has your family been here? She asked. Ezra was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the symbols on the floor. My great-grandfather came here after the mines closed. Most folks left, but he stayed. Said something called to him in the deep places. He was different. Like me. Different how? Linda pressed, her fingers poised over her keyboard. He could hear things others couldn't. Feel the mountain's moods. When he first touched the heart chamber, it was cold, angry. The mining companies had hurt something deep, and it was bleeding heat into the void. Ezra's voice took on a distant quality, as if he was reciting something he'd heard many times before. It took him 20 years to earn enough trust to kindle the first flame. My grandfather added the tunnel system. My father learned to read the deeper currents. And you? Sarah asked softly. Ezra looked at her, and for a moment she saw something ancient in his young eyes. I can do things they couldn't. But every gift comes with a price. The mountain gives freely to those it trusts, but betrayal. He shuddered. There are places in these hills where nothing grows anymore. Places where my ancestors tried to force what should have been freely given. The wind howled outside, but the sound seemed muffled now, as if the cabin existed in a pocket of protected space. Marcus paced to the window again, his business mind clearly wrestling with what he'd witnessed. What if we could find a middle ground, he suggested. Some way to share this responsibly, with proper oversight. The floor bucked beneath them like a living thing, sending everyone scrambling for balance. Books tumbled from shelves, and the amber glow flared bright enough to hurt their eyes. It doesn't want to be shared, Ezra said, his voice strained as he pressed both hands against the symbols. Not like that. Not as a commodity. As quickly as it had started, the shaking stopped, but Sarah noticed that some of the symbols under Ezra's hands were now glowing white-hot, and his face was pale with exhaustion. The storm's almost over, he whispered. You'll all be leaving soon, but you need to decide what you'll take with you. The mountain is listening to every word, feeling every intention. Choose carefully. Outside, Sarah could swear she heard the wind carrying voices, ancient, patient, and watching. The tremor that shook the cabin sent everyone stumbling, books tumbling from shelves and dishes rattling in the cupboards. Sarah grabbed onto Marcus as another wave rolled beneath them, stronger this time, accompanied by a deep groaning that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. What's happening? Elena whispered, her voice barely audible above the rumbling. Thomas stood frozen by the window, his face pale in the lamplight. Outside, the blizzard had intensified, but that wasn't what held his attention. Through the swirling snow, strange lights pulsed beneath the surface of the ground, veins of amber and gold spreading outward from the cabin like the roots of some impossible tree. "The network's expanding," Thomas said quietly. "It's been growing since we first lit the stove." Dr. Chen knelt beside the heating grate, pressing her ear to the floor. The metal vibrated against her cheek, and she could hear something moving through the tunnels below. Not air or water, but something else entirely. Something alive. "This isn't just a heating system," she said, looking up at the others. "It's been using our presence, our body heat, our very life force to grow stronger." Marcus pulled out his phone, the screen casting an eerie blue glow. No signal still, but look at this. He showed them the compass app, the needle spinning wildly before settling on a direction that pointed directly downward. "The magnetic field here is completely distorted." Another tremor shook the cabin, and this time they heard something that made their blood run cold, a sound like breathing, deep and rhythmic, coming from beneath their feet. The floorboards creaked and shifted, as if the cabin itself was rising and falling with each breath. "We need to shut it down," Sarah said, moving toward the stove. "Whatever this thing is, we have to stop it before—" "Before what?" Thomas interrupted, but his question was answered by the sound of splintering wood. Through the kitchen window, they watched as something massive pushed up through the snow-covered ground outside. It looked like a tree root, but it glowed with that same amber light, and it was easily the thickness of a telephone pole. Elena backed away from the window. "Oh God, it's breaking the surface." The breathing sound grew louder, more insistent, and the lights in the tunnels beneath them pulsed in rhythm with it. Whatever they had awakened was no longer content to remain hidden underground. Dr. Chen approached the stove with scientific determination, studying the strange symbols etched into its iron surface. "These markings, they're not decorative, they're some kind of control mechanism." She traced one with her finger, and it glowed brighter at her touch. "Don't touch anything," Marcus warned, but it was too late. The symbol flared with brilliant light, and suddenly the breathing sound stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the noise had been. Thomas moved to stand beside the stove, his young face grave with understanding. "My grandfather didn't build this," he admitted quietly. "He found it. Deep in the mountain, in a chamber that had been sealed for who knows how long. He thought he could control it, use it just for heating. But it's been waiting. Waiting for what?" Sarah demanded. Before Thomas could answer, the floor beneath them began to glow. The wooden planks became translucent, revealing the vast network of tunnels that spread out beneath the cabin like a circulatory system. And at the center of it all, directly below where they stood, was a chamber so large it seemed impossible that the mountain could contain it. Something moved in that chamber, something ancient and patient and utterly alien. Elena stared down through the glowing floor, her voice barely a whisper. "It's not a heating system, it's a body. We're standing on top of something alive." The revelation hit them all at once. The tunnels weren't conduits, they were arteries. The amber glow wasn't artificial light, it was bioluminescence, and the warmth that had kept them alive through the blizzard was coming from a creature so vast that the entire mountain might be just a small part of its body. "The storm," Dr. Chen said, pieces falling into place. "The storm wasn't trapping us here, it was protecting whatever's down there while it used us to regain strength." As if responding to her words, the creature beneath them shifted, and the cabin tilted slightly. Through the windows, they could see more of the glowing roots breaking through the surface, reaching up toward the storm-dark sky like fingers stretching after a long sleep. The symbols on the stove pulsed more rapidly now, and Thomas reached out to touch them. "There might be a way to put it back to sleep," he said, "but I don't know if we have enough time." Outside, something roared, a sound so deep and powerful that it seemed to come from the mountain itself. The blizzard swirled faster, and in the distance they could see lights beginning to flicker on in the valley below. Other cabins, other settlements, all connected to the same vast network they had unknowingly awakened. The creature was waking up, and they were standing directly on top of its heart. The morning sun broke through the dissipating clouds, casting long shadows across the snow-covered clearing. Sarah stood at the cabin window, watching Marcus trudge through knee-deep drifts toward the tree line. He moved with purpose now, no longer the withdrawn boy they'd first encountered. The events of the past week had changed him, changed all of them. "The road should be clear by noon," Detective Morrison said, folding his satellite phone. "Search and rescue confirmed they've got crews working this direction." Dr. Chen nodded absently, her fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table where she'd spread her hastily scrawled notes. "We need to discuss what we tell them. The truth," Elena said firmly, though her voice carried uncertainty. "How else do we explain what happened here? Do we?" Morrison's weathered face creased with doubt. Who's going to believe that a 15-year-old boy channeled geothermal energy through some kind of telepathic connection to underground creatures? Sarah turned from the window. "We all saw it. We all felt it." "Seeing and proving are different things," Dr. Chen murmured. "I've been over my observations a dozen times. The temperature readings, the impossible heat distribution, the way the tunnels seem to respond to Marcus's emotional state." She shook her head. "It defies every principle of thermodynamics I know." Through the glass, Sarah watched Marcus kneel beside one of the ventilation shafts they'd discovered the night before. Steam no longer rose from the opening, and the warmth that had saved their lives had retreated back into the mountain's depths. Whatever network existed below had gone quiet again. "Maybe that's the point," Elena said softly. "Some things aren't meant to be explained, analyzed, exploited." The word hung heavy in the air. They all knew what she meant. If word spread about Marcus's abilities, about what lay beneath the mountain, their quiet refuge would become a circus. Scientists, government officials, corporate interests, all descending like vultures on a boy who'd asked for nothing more than to be left alone. Morrison cleared his throat. "The official report will state that we took shelter during the blizzard and survived using the cabin's heating system, a remarkable wood-burning stove design created by the boy's grandfather." "And the tunnels?" Dr. Chen asked. "Old mining shafts, natural geothermal venting. Nothing unusual for this region." Sarah saw Marcus rise and begin walking back toward the cabin. His shoulders seemed lighter somehow, as if he'd made peace with something during his solitary communion with the mountain. "He saved our lives," she said quietly. "Yes," Morrison agreed. "And now we save his." The cabin door opened, bringing with it a gust of crisp mountain air. Marcus stomped the snow from his boots and looked at each of them in turn. "They're sleeping again," he said simply. "Deep sleep. They won't wake unless—" He paused, searching for words. "Unless they're needed again." "And you?" Elena asked gently. "How do you feel?" Marcus considered this with the gravity of someone far older than his 15 years. "Different. Like I understand something I didn't before. Grandpa used to say the mountain chooses who it trusts. I always thought he meant the weather, the terrain, but it's more than that." He moved to the stove, running his hand along its iron surface. This was never just about heat. It was about connection, balance, taking care of each other, us and them. Dr. Chen leaned forward. "Them?" "The Guardians. That's what Grandpa called them. They've been down there longer than anyone knows, keeping the mountain's heart warm. When I was little, I thought they were just stories. But during the blizzard, when you all needed help—" Marcus's voice trailed off. "They answered your call," Sarah finished. "Our call," Marcus corrected. "They felt all of us, your fear, your need. That's why they came so close to the surface. That's why the tunnels opened up." Morrison stood and moved to the window. In the distance, he could hear the faint rumble of engines, the rescue crews making their way up the mountain road. Soon this interlude would end, and they'd all return to their separate lives in the city below. "Will you be all right here alone?" Elena asked Marcus. The boy smiled. the first genuine smile any of them had seen from him. "I'm not alone. I never was. I just forgot for a while." As if responding to his words, the cabin seemed to exhale around them. The walls settled with a contented sigh, the floorboards creaked in harmony, and for just a moment, Sarah could have sworn she felt something vast and ancient stirring far below, acknowledging their presence with benevolent awareness. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder. Their time was almost up. "Promise me something," Marcus said, looking at each of them intently. "When people ask about what happened here, remember that some mysteries are meant to stay hidden. Some connections are too important to break." One by one, they nodded.